Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Sanford Institute's last spring speaker series session. Before we get started, I just want to let you all know that the summer sessions will start next month, so be sure to stay tuned on Eventbrite when that's open for registration. Now, back to today's speaker, we have Olivia Jurkiewicz, who will be presenting on suppressing negative emotions. Suppressing negative emotion undermines compassionate responding during conversations. Just a little bit about Olivia. She studies how individuals experience, express, and make sense of emotions within interpersonal interactions at work. This includes contexts such as collaboration and conflict. Olivia takes a relational view of emotion by examining how emotions are expressed by one individual and subsequently interpreted and responded to by others. She explores how these processes shape individual, interpersonal, and organizational outcomes. Olivia's research has been invited for revision at Journal of Applied Psychology, published in Emotion and Affective Science. She is a recipient of a two-year pre-doctoral fellowship from the Sanford Institute, and recently she has accepted a postdoc at Stony Brook University. Please feel free to submit any questions through the Zoom chat function during the presentation, but note that these questions will only be answered at the very end. And without further ado, please welcome Olivia Jurkiewicz.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm so excited to be here presenting my work. This is my dissertation work, actually. I'm very glad and appreciative of the invitation by the Sanford Institute. And this work specifically is on how, when we suppress our own negative emotions in conversations, we actually undermine our ability to respond with compassion to others when they're experiencing suffering. And before I get into the details, I just want to thank some really important people. Number one is my collaborator, my advisor, Chris Ovius. He is integral to making this work happen. So thank you. And then the whole lab, amazing people. Greg, Saida, Rushi, Amanda, thank you for all your support throughout this. And then obviously the Sanford Institute for giving me funding. I couldn't have done this research without you all, so I'm very appreciative. Yeah. Okay, so I just want to talk briefly about how I think about emotions and compassion. I don't just think about the individual experiencing emotions or suffering. I also think about how others respond to that, and I look at the social exchange happening. So I think of compassion as really occurring between two people in a conversation. And so using that perspective, that's how I approach questions about why we struggle to experience compassion and express compassion. Okay. So we're gonna all imagine this scenario. We have Derek, the discloser. He is working on a project that has a couple of setbacks and he's feeling like a failure. He goes and talks to his coworker, Rebecca, who is the responder in this situation. She has the opportunity to express compassion. And in this context, she does. She tells Derek that I'm so sorry this is happening to you. Something similar happened to me, and I'm here to help you. Let me know what I can do. So she responds with compassion. And the components of compassionate responding are three core ones. That's expressing validation, understanding, and care. So displaying those verbally and non-verbally. And specifically in organizations, compassion. So I'm from Brady School of Management, so I like to think about the importance of compassion in the workplace in particular. And so there are a whole host of benefits of compassion in organizations. The first is on the individual. The individual can recover from negative events better when they receive compassion from others. Um, for the two people, the relationship, when you express compassion, you can build a higher quality relationship. And then finally, at this macro level, when compassion is felt, expressed, it coordinates collective action to solve problems better. Okay. Although we all know, especially here, we know how important compassion is, there's a lot of compassion failure happening. especially in our organizations. So only 25% of employees believe that their employers care. And when organizations attempt to engage in compassion efforts, especially at this macro level, that is perceived as inauthentic. And the real reason why I think these perceptions are happening, these perceptions of inauthenticity, is because compassion needs to occur during the moment when suffering happens. So when someone expresses suffering, the responder needs to be able to respond with compassion in that moment. So these disconnected expressions of compassion may not be as valuable as responding with compassion within the conversation context. Okay. So why does compassion fail? There's a lot of perspectives that are important in understanding why compassion fails. One is that some individuals are just more compassionate than others. There's this trait compassion, but maybe this only doesn't explain all of the variance in actual compassionate behavior. And then there's another perspective that it's all about motivation. So if individuals really want to care for others, they should. But we know that care professionals can fail at compassionate responding in those moments that it matters the most. And these are the most motivated to care. These are individuals that are in these professions because they are compassionate individuals and they're failing. And leaders report that they struggle to respond with compassion, even though they really want to. So, why is all of this compassion failure occurring? And I take this interpersonal perspective um, and really understand what's happening between two different people during there are two people during the conversation, and I focus on the emotions felt and expressed in the conversation and what emotion regulation strategies these individuals are using. Okay. What is happening during these conversations? And we're going to focus in on Rebecca, the responder. So this is the individual that should be expressing compassion. And so during these conversations, Rebecca is experiencing negative emotions. And that's because Derek is expressing negative emotions, and negative emotions are contagious and they can amplify during the course of a conversation. And then Rebecca can either choose to express these negative emotions during the conversation or hide them. And when she hides them, she is engaging in this emotion regulation strategy called suppression. This is when you hide your emotion expressions. And there's clear negative consequences of engaging it on the self of using suppression. But it's less known what are the interpersonal consequences. So, on how we behave on others and their social perceptions of the responder. So, what are the interpersonal consequences of suppressing negative emotions, in particular on compassionate responding? And first, I want to talk a little bit about why individuals would use suppression in these conversations, or why they may think it's useful for compassionate responding. So, this like alternative hypothesis. So, some individuals may think that suppressing negative emotions helps manage those negative emotions. And there's evidence for this that using suppression can quickly and temporarily blunt the experience of negative emotions. And that you may think that that supports compassionate responding. And then also, it may not be appropriate to express negative emotions, especially in workplace settings. So individuals may use suppression because it's normative. And then finally, individuals may think that expressing negative emotions is a burden on another person, so you want to hide those. Like that is going to benefit the other person. But I theorize that suppressing negative emotions is not helpful. And specifically, I hypothesize that suppressing one's negative emotion during these conversations undermines compassionate responding. And that's because compassionate responding requires noticing, accurately identifying, and understanding another person. So this all requires this other-oriented attention. So other-oriented attention is critical in being able to respond compassionately. However, maintaining attention on others is cognitively difficult. And when one suppresses their negative emotions, they end up focusing on themselves. So redirecting their attention um, from others to the self. And so that is the theoretical model here. When you suppress your negative emotions, you are reorienting your attention from the other person to the self, thus undermining your ability to respond compassionately. Okay. So I'm going to go through a couple of different studies in which I test these hypotheses using different contexts, different methods. And the first in study one is this more straightforward experimental design. So in this study, and I'm testing specifically the overall question, does suppression undermine compassionate responding? So that first hypothesis in this study. And what I do is I bring in, or I use Prolific to have full-time workers watch a video of Katie. And here's an image of Katie. And this is a 90-second video of Katie talking about suffering she's experiencing at work. And she has a manager that's micromanaging her and causing her so much distress that she ends up quitting her job. And in this video, she cries and she expresses a lot of negative emotion. And participants are randomly assigned into two conditions. The first is they're asked to suppress their negative emotion expressions while listening to Katie. And in the control condition, they're told to just behave naturally. So if they have these natural expressions of negative emotions, like furrowing their brow or frowning, they should go ahead and just express those. Okay. And then after listening to Katie, they record a 30 to 60-second audio response in which they give Katie advice on how to deal with this situation. Okay, so every participant records this audio response, and I'm going to go through two different examples, transcripts of participants' responses. But to get the outcome of compassionate responding, we behaviorally code compassionate responding. So we have two research assistants listen to all the recordings and code care, understanding, and validation. And we create a composite of compassionate responding. And these two research assistants have really great backgrounds. One of them worked with the suicide hotline, so she has a lot of experience with evaluating, emotional experiences in others. So really great research assistants here, and there was good reliability between both of them. Okay. So here are example responses, and I want to talk a little bit about these responses generally. So just generally looking through the responses, the majority of people are compassionate in this study. It's easy to be compassionate. Katie is experiencing a lot of suffering. She's a likable person. So the majority of participants are kind, trying to provide help. They're compassionate. Nobody is mean or anything like that. And so, because of this, the way we coded compassion is really one refers to no compassion. That doesn't mean they're being mean. It just means that the participants aren't expressing understanding, care, and validation. They're maybe just giving practical advice. And then five means a lot of compassionate responding, and three is like this moderate amount. So here's an example of low compassionate responding from one participant. They said a bunch, and this is just a part of what they said. This participant says, what I would advise you to do is to see your direct supervisor and tell them exactly how you feel and how there's micromanaging going on. Perhaps the person is doing so intentionally, or perhaps the person does this to everyone. So this isn't a mean response, it just doesn't have those components of compassionate responding. So here is an example of high compassionate responding. This participant says, I'm really sorry to hear that. That sounds like it would be extremely frustrating and stressful. Have you talked to your supervisor about that? I wonder if they would be able to offer you advice on how to shield yourself from this person. But regardless, it doesn't negate the fact that they're acting out of line. So that would be a really tough situation to be in. And what's interesting is both of these responses give the similar types of advice, practical advice, but this high compassionate responding have these components of understanding, like expressing that I understand the emotions you're experiencing, and then validation that although I give you this advice, it's important to note that your feelings and the situation is inappropriate. So that's an example of these are components of compassionate responding. Okay, now to the main results. So on the x-axis, we have the two conditions, the control condition where they're told to express their emotions naturally. And then then we have suppression. So that's they're asked to suppress their negative emotion expressions while they're listening to Katie, not when they're giving the response, but while they're listening to her. And that's because when you're suppressing your negative emotions, you're likely not focusing on Katie, you're focusing on yourself. So that is the theorized mechanism. And on the y-axis, we have compassionate responding. So what we find is those told to suppress their negative emotion expressions engage in less compassionate responding. And I did control for negative emotion because it may be that when you suppress your negative emotions, you may experience more negative emotions, and that prevents you from engaging in compassion. But I don't see that playing a role here necessarily in this study in particular. And that really points to this attentional mechanism. Yeah. Okay. So in study two, the purpose of this study is really to bring it into a more natural setting where there are real opportunities for compassionate responding, where people are actually having conversations with each other. Because just responding to someone online might not be the same as actually talking to someone in real life who's experiencing distress. And really wanted to capture that mechanism of other-oriented attention in this study too. Okay. So to create these real opportunities of compassionate responding, I bring in one participant randomly assigned to be the discloser. And then they engage in 2 rounds of stressful interviews in which they pitch why they are the best candidate for their dream job. And the top 3 participants with the best second round interview receive a $100 reward. And to really elicit the stress response in participants, they have a judge evaluating them while they're pitching. And so this is adapted from the Trier social stress test. It reliably elicits a stress response. Okay. Then we bring in a responder participant. And this participant and the discloser have a support conversation in between these two rounds of interviews. And this is really that opportunity for the responder to express compassion to the discloser. Okay. The responders are told, all of the responders are told to just help the discloser perform their best and feel less anxious. And they're also given the same incentive so that if their discloser is in the top three best second round pitches, then they also receive a $100 reward. So they're also yoked to that incentive. And then the discloser during this conversation just reflects on how they performed and how they want to do better. So this is a lab situation in which these disclosers are truly feeling stress, and the responders have this real opportunity to respond with compassion. And how do I capture suppression? I measure trait suppression of the responders. And this is, a reliable way to get at what people do to manage their negative emotions, their tendency to suppress their negative emotions. And one example item is I control my emotions by not expressing them. And then at the end of the conversation, responders report on their compassionate responding, the extent that they express validation, understanding, and concern during the conversation. And one example item is I really listen to the other person. Okay. And at the beginning of this conversation, I capture a physiological measure of other-oriented attention. And I can do this because attention is this physiological process where we, orient towards another person, like our bodies orient towards another person, our pupils dilate. So other-oriented attention is physiological. And it's rooted in the autonomic nervous system, specifically the vagus nerve. And greater changes in vagal reactivity reflect other-oriented attention. Okay. So here are the results. What I find is those individuals who have greater trait suppression, when they are exposed to this person who's suffering, they have this opportunity to express compassion. They don't do that as much. So this is negatively associated. Okay. And on the attentional mechanism measured physiologically, I see that individuals with greater trait suppression have less of that vagal reactivity at the beginning of the conversation. And that vagal reactivity is associated with greater compassionate responding. And this is fully mediated through this pathway. And I want to highlight an important component on the discloser's performance. So when disclosers had more compassionate responders, they reported greater perceived warmth, trust, and connection. They performed better from time one to time two and had lower physiological stress. So compassion was really important in this paradigm for the disclosers, not just relationally, but also on their performance. Okay, great. So the final study is study 3. And really, there was a couple of aims in this study. The first is to have this context of suffering. So in study 2, it's more of a performance context. And in study 3, we wanted a context of suffering and to measure compassion from the discloser, not from a third-party observer or from the responder's perspective, but from the discloser, because the discloser is the person who matters in this situation. Their perceptions of compassion is the most important in evaluating the compassionate responding. So that's what the upgrade in this study is measuring compassion perceived. Um, so the extent that the disclosure perceived the responder as being compassionate. And it's also interesting because suppression happens in real time and it varies across the course of a conversation. So when you manage your emotions, it can happen minute by minute. So we wanted to capture suppression um, in real time as it varies over the course of the conversation to really see at this granular level if suppressing negative emotions can impact perceptions of compassion. And so to do this, we had 158 conversations between undergrads, and we look at 48 data points per conversation. And so this paradigm is very similar to study two. There is a discloser and a responder, and there is a 4-minute suffering conversation. And then after the conversation, participants go into separate rooms and continuously rate different measures that I'm going to go through right now. So they use the slider scale to continuously rate measures of perceived compassion, of negative emotion. And these are the two key measures I'm going to talk about today. So the first is perceived compassion. That's the extent to which the discloser perceived the responder as compassionate. And you can see on the image here, perceptions of compassion. This is just one dyad, one real dyad from the study. And you can see that perceptions of compassion can vary across the conversation, which is an interesting finding in itself. But yeah, so it's important to capture this variance in perceptions of compassion. Okay, so the second, so the IV, the independent variable, is suppression of negative emotions. And we get that through emotion expression minus emotion experience. And I'm going to go through the details of that. So first, we had, or not necessarily first, but we had 9 trained observers watch these conversations and rate expressions of negative emotion on the responder. So they continuously rate that. And then we also have the self report from the responder of their own experience of negative emotions. And so by comparing those two together, we get suppression. So the extent that someone is experiencing a negative emotion, but not showing it. Okay. And so that is that blue line right here, or that, the blue line is suppression. And that also varies, which is interesting. Okay, so the simple or the main analysis here is to look at the relationship between suppressing the responder suppressing their negative emotions and the extent they are perceived as compassionate by the discloser. Okay, so on the x-axis, we have suppression of negative emotions. And on the y-axis, again, we have the perceived compassion, the extent that the discloser perceived the responder as being compassionate. And then the data I'm going to put on the slide before I show you all, each individual line represents a dyad, so one conversation, and then there's a dark line that represents the main effect. Okay. So what we see is that those who, or overall, when you suppress your negative emotions within the conversation, that results in less perceptions of compassion. Okay. Yeah, so that's the big finale result here. And I think it's really important to highlight again that this is occurring within the conversation. And this also points to this attentional mechanism that when you're suppressing your negative emotions, you are likely shifting your attention to yourself in a way that is actually observable by the other person. And so that's really exciting too, because it tells us that we're sensitive to how others are managing their emotions at this shorter temporal level. Um, and so this has major contributions not only to the compassion literature, but also um, how we manage our emotions and how that can impact our social relationships, how we're perceived by others. So, the major contribution of this work is to try to understand why compassion fails in conversations and to really think about the emotions between both people during a conversation and really building on this idea that we catch others' negative emotions when they express them, and we need to be able to understand what to do with those negative emotions. And I find that we shouldn't be hiding them. We shouldn't be expressing that or shouldn't be hiding them. We should maybe consider expressing them or naturally expressing those negative emotions. And that's because when we suppress our negative emotions, our attention is focused on the self instead of the other. And that other focused attention is so important in compassionate responding. Being able to express or being able to understand another person and their experience, um, identify their emotions, these are all important um, components of enacting compassion effectively. And I think some theoretical contributions of this work is I introduce a new interpersonal perspective on compassion failure. So considering both people and that attention is important in understanding compassion failure. And then also linking suppression to that. So are the emotion regulation strategies that we use. And I'll talk a little bit about future directions. Um, when I've presented this work at other places, other universities, I do get this question a lot where people actually ask me, why does compassion matter in the workplace? And they constantly ask that question, which is quite surprising for me. As someone who really cares about compassion, I think it's obvious that we need compassion, how important compassion is for the self, for relationships, for our ability to collaborate with each other. But I notice that I keep getting this question. So I think that there is variability in our beliefs of how important compassion is. So I think that that's like an interesting thing someone should explore at some point. Um, yeah. And then I'm also interested in exploring the long-term performance consequences of compassionate responding. So, not just looking at what stops compassionate responding, but when we're effective at compassionate responding, how that benefits that disclosure, not just immediately, but over time. Maybe months later, that person has positive benefits because they receive that compassion, maybe from their manager, for instance. And then I'm also interested in looking at how to improve compassion in different workplace interactions like conflict and feedback. I've been asked this question pretty often about suppression, maybe when you're in a more antagonistic interaction, or maybe you're giving feedback about someone's poor performance. Should you express compassion? How do you increase compassion in those contexts where there's negative emotions that might be directed towards the responder. And probably not expressing anger is the right situation or right way to respond in that setting, but I don't necessarily think suppressing our negative emotions in that context is good either. So I'm interested in studying this theory in different contexts.